All right. So in today's video, I'm going to be making a quick response to a video called Against Utilitarianism and Consequentialism Within the Vegan Movement. It's by a guy whose name is
À-bas-le-ciel.
This video.
All right. So before I get started, I just want to talk a little bit about why I'm making this video. I'm not in the business of making mean attack videos. I'm not in the business of trying to show that people are idiots or anything like that. But I am in the business of talking about utilitarianism. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy. I do work in normative and applied ethics, and I'm a utilitarian, and I'm really interested in making sure that people have a good understanding of the theory. So what I'm going to be doing is just sort of watching this video, giving some thoughts about it, pointing out the things that I think he gets right, and we'll see whether there's any places where I disagree with his interpretation of utilitarianism. But fundamentally, I'm responding to this video because I do think that after watching it, I don't think this guy is unintelligent. I don't think that he's completely wrong about utilitarianism, but I do think that there are a couple of pretty common misunderstandings about what the theory is supposed to do, how it works, how utilitarians use it, that are just worth talking about. But there's no animosity in making this video. I just want to kind of make that clear from the get-go. All right, let's go for it.
It opens with an historical analogy, and then we get straight to the point. I read the
I've sped it up
autobiography
a little
of
bit.
a Christian preacher, a Protestant, a white man who went from Europe to North America, and then from North America to what is today Myanmar, then the British colony of Burma. He was a brilliant linguist. He learned many of the local languages. He actually wrote hymns. He wrote songs for local people to sing that converted them to Christianity. Hardworking man with a brilliant mind. Shame that he used it to such a bad purpose. But of course, in his way, he was a man very much committed to his own morality. A moral code I disagree with, but a moral code nevertheless. When he was living there in Myanmar, of course, in very, very hard conditions over 100 years ago, much tougher than anything we endure today, he received gifts from supporters all around the world who learned about the work he was doing through Christian missionary bulletins, newspapers, and this sort of thing. And every so often, he'd receive handmade gifts from the southern United States, woven baskets, or what have you. And every single time, despite the poverty and difficulty he lived in, despite his remote location, he made the effort to pack them up in boxes and ship them all the way back to the United States, wherever it was they come from, with a note explaining that he does not accept gifts from slave owners, that he does not accept gifts that are made by slaves. In many ways, from my perspective, he was a man whose whole life was devoted to taking free people and making them into slaves, destroying their culture, destroying their language, destroying their...
I want to start by just saying I love the example. And I think that, I think his name is Izel. I think Izel and I are on the same page about, that this guy's a pretty admirable dude. It's sort of a mark against him that he was doing missionary work. But, this kind of moral commitment to not sending, just sending back the baskets, to kind of refusing to benefit from slavery, I think at a time when it was legal, is a really remarkable thing, and he should be commended for it. And I think I have good utilitarian arguments for that conclusion, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I just wanted to start by just kind of with a conciliatory, just saying, I agree that this is a remarkable human being who we should hold up to high esteem.
Their independence and converting them to a foreign ideology that, in a sense,
except for that part,
in a very abstract sense, is slavery.
We agree that that's not
But
good.
he was standing up on point of moral principle. Now, the people I've been debating with lately, I can't believe this is a controversial issue. They might question, well, what harm is actually done by the basket itself? If you use this basket, you're not enslaving anyone, you're not torturing anyone, you're not directly approving of or endorsing slavery.
Good. Let's talk about that for a second. So he is right that there's one sense in which using a basket that's been sent to you doesn't in itself add more exploitation to the slaves, doesn't exploit them in new ways. However, if we're going to be asking the question of utilitarianism, if we're interested in figuring out, I'll explain what the theory is in a minute, but if we're trying to figure out what's going to make the world better, what's going to bring about the best possible consequences, we do have some strong moral reasons to abstain even from the practice of using the basket. And one reason for that is that if you send this basket back, that sends a powerful anti-slavery message. these people from the South, sending this guy the baskets are probably thinking, oh yeah, he's one of us. Like he, we're all like on the same team about this. You send that back and you sort of are able to do this really powerful symbolic kind of gesture to say, no, we're not all on the same page. You folks are supporting slavery and I don't actually support that. And that is a very powerful consequence, right? If you're trying to be involved in this kind of boycott of anti-slavery, doing things like that are going to be important. They're going to be important ways of contributing to that boycott and contributing to increasing like the stigma against slavery and all of that. So I think right off the bat, it's just important to point out that there are some things that that somebody who cares about consequences is going to say, right, to this example. And that's why I think as a consequentialist and as a utilitarian, I'm going to be supportive of his move of sending back the basket. All right, let's keep going.
Are you? It is, from my perspective, completely surreal that in the year 2018, I've had this passionate response from vegans who've stood up one after another and tried, in that sense, it's most controversial, measuring the same answer again and again. There's something there that's really, if you are a vegan, therefore you regard the use of animal products as bad, as something to be avoided. So therefore, using leather is something bad, it's something to be avoided, assuming you're not abandoned on a desert island, assuming you're not in a situation where you will freeze to death unless you wear this leather coat. That's not what we're debating. We're talking about this.
So let's just be really clear what he just said. What he said was that using animal products is bad. He didn't say that using animal products is intrinsically bad. What he said is that it's bad. And the question for the utilitarian, which we're going to come to in a little bit, is does the utilitarian have the resources to say that using animal products is bad? And I think, we're going to talk about this later, but I do think that the answer is yes, but we're gonna keep going. The other thing that he just said was that we're not going to talk about like desert island scenarios or scenarios where you maybe you would die if you don't use the animal products. And what's important to note about that is that once you make little allowances like that, you no longer have this exceptionless like deontic constraint against use. It's more that that's one thing that needs to be weighed against a whole lot of other things, right? So I'm just pointing out, right, that so far in the video, he's not giving us a really strong kind of, it is always wrong to use animal products. It's more that it's bad to use animal products. But in some cases, it might be outweighed by other sorts of badness, or there might be situations where it's still okay to use them, like the desert island scenario, which he's setting aside. All right, let's keep going.
Within veganism, this is the status of secondhand leather within veganism, and the counter arguments that are presented to me are really surreal. They're bad. Let's say you have two identical brothers, and they both show up at a vegan protest wearing fur coats, but one of them says, "Oh, don't worry, I got the coat for free. I got it secondhand, or it was a hand-me-down from my grandmother." And the other one says, "Oh, I bought it. I paid cash. I ordered it." You really think this is different? They are men wearing leather coats. Sorry, in this case, fur coats, what have you. The only thing my argument rests on is the very basic concept that wearing a leather coat is still wearing a leather coat. Using fur, using animal products, or using animals is still using animals, whether or not you have this excuse for it, whether or not you are removed from the moral act, the moral decision of choosing to buy that product by one or two stages, whether it's because you got it secondhand, or because you got it as a hand-me-down for your brother, or what have you. So the counter argument must be, and this is what I've challenged people to say, is what is the difference you see between these two identical twin brothers? Now, another...
Yeah, so just to be clear, the second example he's giving is that you have two brothers who show up to a protest, they're identical twins, they both had leather coats. One of them bought the coat, the other was given, received the coat as like a hand-me-down. And the question is there a difference? And the utilitarian, the consequentialist or the utilitarian they're both going to say like, don't wear leather coats to vegan protests. Like, it's not clear to me why, where we're heading, because I don't know if anybody watching has ever been to a vegan protest, but there's often people in the audience looking for examples of animal products. One of my friends just texted me a little while ago, and she was like, "Hey, check out my new Instagram picture." When I looked at it, I saw that some cow farmers were criticizing what they perceived to be like leather. I think it was like leather boots. And I've been to protests myself where people in the audience are like, "Hey, you're wearing leather. You're a hypocrite," um, even though the people in the protests are just using fake leather, right? So that's bad. That's bad for having a successful protest. And if you're trying to maximize the goodness of consequences, you're not going to be running a protest in such a way that you're going to undermine your message by wearing leather, right? So utilitarian or not, like, don't show up to protests wearing leather. It's unclear to me why a utilitarian would be motivated to wear leather to a vegan protest, regardless of how it was obtained, because regardless of whether it was purchased or whether it was donated or whatever, it's still going to have the effect of hurting the protest, right? And we'll talk about some other things that it does a little bit later, but that, so far, like, it's not clear where we're going.
Illustration of this that, again, none of the people debate with have had any terribly good answer to was cost. That's not too terribly hypothetical. A lot of political discussion about that. What is the meaning? What's the significance of that? Well, wearing a T-shirt of that cost. Nevertheless, there's a slogan of this kind, and these people believe in adopting animals' bodies. Now, there is an answer to this. The T-shirt stating a slogan of this kind, and yet to refuse to see the significance of actually wearing the dismembered pieces of animals' bodies. Now, there is an answer to this question. And the answer is that these people believe in a doctrine which is sometimes called utilitarianism and sometimes called consequentialism. In the context of this conversation, they boil down to the same thing. I've realized.
So no, they don't. We're going to talk a little about the difference. So consequentialism is the theory. I guess, whatever. If he wants to have a conversation with him meaning the same thing, that's totally fine. But it's important to point out that these don't mean the same thing. So a consequentialist theory is a theory that says that what we should do is bring about the results that have the most overall good. Okay, we're trying to maximize overall goodness of results. And there's lots of different theories about what goodness of results is. So if you could be a consequentialist who's trying to maximize satisfaction of rights, or a consequentialist who's trying to maximize freedom or liberty or whatever else you want to talk about. Utilitarianism is a specific answer to the question, what is the good that we're trying to maximize? So utilitarian is going to say that the good that we're trying to maximize overall is utility. And what's utility? Utility is not money, despite what economists might try to model. Utility is either like the satisfaction of preferences, or it's the satisfaction, or it's pleasure, or just some other type of well-being. Or in some cases, you have what are called objective list theories of utilitarianism, where there's a whole list of things that we're trying to maximize. So you might say like pleasure and preference satisfaction and rights, protections and freedom and whatever else you want to talk about. But the point is that these are different theories. Consequentialism is a theory that says that there could be all sorts of consequences that have to be, that count towards maximizing the good. Utilitarian is a specific version of a consequentialism that says that the good is utility. All right, so let's keep going.
Those words do not have the same meaning, but they pertain to this question in the same way. Now, I'm going to put in a trigger warning here. If this hasn't been...
Okay, that's fair enough. It might be the case that the consequentialist theories that he has in mind and utilitarianism will all agree about the cases that he brings up. But I do think that it's still important to notice the difference between the two theories, right? Or the two terms. All right.
Been disturbing enough for you. We're going to get into some really disturbing examples, psychologically disturbing. If you believe in consequentialism, you believe in judging the ethics of an action by its consequences, by its outcomes.
True. And
in many instances, that is very plainly evil, in my opinion. And within the vegan movement, it leads to absurd contradictions, conclusions, and excuse-making. Excuse-making that is so strictly parallel to the excuses that meat eaters make for eating meat that, frankly, it blows my mind. Any of these vegans can take themselves seriously when offering these excuses for wearing secondhand leather, or indeed, I should add, when they make these same excuses for eating secondhand meat. Every single one of these people who supports wearing secondhand leather would also stand by eating meat or eating cheese in circumstances where you didn't pay for it. So again, this is freeloading. This is free riding on someone else's bad decision. So a very real world scenario. One of the people I talked to is a university student. So he's often in situations at a university meeting where someone else has bought a pizza for everyone to share. Let's say there's both meat and cheese on the pizza. It's a pepperoni pizza, and everyone can have a slice for free. And he thinks there's no moral significance to him as a vegan eating meat and cheese. He thinks that's...
Well, so this guy is wrong. Um, Now, like, if you're trying to do utilitarianism, you're just doing it wrong. Like, if so, I've been to plenty of meetings where it's in like the university department, and like if you just go and you eat the cheese and pepperoni pizza, that's what they're going to order next time. If you're trying to, you know, get more vegans, you're trying to like have more vegan food in places, you're trying to make veganism more accessible to people so that they'll be, you know, better able to consider it and to try it out. One of the worst ways you could possibly do that is to just go and not eat like plants, to go and like actually eat animals in public. So I I don't know. I mean, like I'm just kind of like speechless as a utilitarian because I don't know why a utilitarian would be motivated to do that. Like I'm motivated by my utilitarianism to, as much as I can, avoid sitting at the table with people eating bodies and secretions. I don't observe the liberation pledge in all contexts, but most of the time, like I try to avoid even doing that because I don't want to communicate by being there that that's okay, right? Um, and the reason why I don't want to do that is because the consequences of doing that are really bad. The consequences are that I fail to make use of an opportunity to challenge speciesism, and I fail to make use of an opportunity to try to push for people eating plants and to normalize people eating plants, right? So, um, yeah, that's the response. It's just that this is not like you might be using the word utilitarianism, but I don't think it means what you think it does. All right, let's keep going.
That's morally neutral just because he didn't purchase it. Again, the instance of the basket made by slaves. So you think that simply because this basket was given to you, you didn't enslave the people. You're not participating in, you're not benefiting from slavery by using the basket. Again, basket's it's a very remote example compared to eating, eating the bodies of dead animals. It's mind blowing to me. This perspective, consequentialism, entails certain absurdities, precisely because it shifts the locus of our judgment to the consequences, to the outcomes, which may be quite irrelevant to the moral character of the person making the decision or doing the act.
Good. All right. So now is where I gotta do a little bit more normative ethics to try to help us through this. So there's a distinction that ethicists make between a theory of rightness, a theory of like what makes an action right, and a theory of deliberation, a theory that tells us how to deliberate about what is right. Okay. Utilitarianism is a theory of rightness. Consequentialism is a family of theories of rightness. What they tell us is that at the end of the day, regardless of how you get to that action, the action that brings about the best, like the most amount of overall good, is the right action. There's some disagreement, like Alistair Norcross, the scalar utilitarian, doesn't think that deontic terms like right should apply, but we're going to just sort of like set that aside, right? For the most part, utilitarians, a theory of that, it says that the right action is the one that brings about the best overall consequences. We understand best overall consequences, the consequences that have the greatest amount of overall utility in them, right? But utilitarians from as long as Jeremy Bentham, like from as long ago as Jeremy Bentham, have noticed that sometimes the best way to maximize utility is to not try to maximize utility. He says this in a note to like it came about it was like a note that he added to principles of morals and legislation, but like he knew that back in the day. John Stuart Mill talks about this in his book Utilitarianism. He talks about how it would be to conjoin utilitarianism to universal idiocy, to suppose that utilitarians are always calculating utility all the time whenever they're making decisions. And then later on, R.M. Hare, who was Peter Singer's dissertation advisor, really took this idea farther, and he wrote a book called Moral Thinking, Its Levels, Method, and Point. And he develops this theory of two-level utilitarianism. And the way that this theory goes, and it's basically like an expansion of Mill's idea, which is an expansion of Bentham's idea, is that when we try to calculate utility, we often do it wrong. And there's three things that we often do. Sometimes we just don't have enough information to do the calculation, Other times we have enough information, but we're not really good at calculating. We kind of make mistakes. And the third thing that can go wrong is that we're subject to like motivated reasoning. We can try to cook the data in our own favor. And because of that, going out and trying to calculate utility all the time isn't the best way of being utilitarian. In general, we should be following like other sorts of rules, like don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't kill people, don't commit acts of violence, because that, like, just following those rules is going to, help you avoid the mistake of miscalculating utility, where it might seem to you like some situation is going to maximize utility, but it's just sort of like your own selfish interests that are pointing you to that, right? And I think that what this is bringing out is the difference between a theory of right action and a theory of moral deliberation, where utilitarians are going to have to tell you how you should deliberate, and it's often not going to involve like calculating utility for those three reasons, right? We often don't have enough information to do the calculation because we don't know what all the possible consequences of our action are. We often don't know how to, like, we often are going to make mistakes when we're calculating. And then finally, we're at risk of cooking the data, right? So that's what I want to say there. Another thing they talk about, and Mill talks about this in utilitarianism, is that we should care about character and virtue. We should care about developing like a good moral character so that we go out and doing the right sorts of actions is like comes naturally to us. We don't want to develop a character such that, we're constantly looking and scheming and trying to find ways of cheating the system and doing bad things, always trying to find little loopholes to do bad things. Because if we cultivate that kind of character, we're going to be disposed to calculate utility badly and to actually commit lots of selfish acts that don't increase overall utility and instead just like support our own like selfish interests, right? So we'll go on, but this is just to say that I think what's happening is that there's a conflation between a theory of right action and a theory of deliberation, and there's no reason for a utilitarian to ever make that mistake. But I think that's what our friend is accusing utilitarians of doing. All right, let's keep going.
I have heard two cases in depth of men who committed rape against women. Again, every possible trigger warning. You might want to close the video now. This is going to disturb you. Men who committed rape against women, and the women were completely unaware, and they had no psychological consequences or distress, or they didn't even know what had happened until the police contacted them and presented with evidence. In one of the cases, the man had filmed himself committing the crime, and then indeed this was used to convict him. And the woman who was the victim, she had absolutely no memory of it. Drugs were involved. In another case, the man was a surgeon. So again, he had the drugs used to put someone to sleep to endure surgery. So they had no physical experience, they had no side effect, no harm, no psychological consequence. So you can compare two different rapists or three different rapists. We can come up with different scenarios where the consequences are utterly, utterly different. In one case, there was trauma and the woman's life is destroyed. One had pregnancy in one case, that the rape results in pregnancy and changes the whole woman's life forever in all kinds of ways, psychologically, physically, economically. And then you have another case where absolutely nothing changes. There are no consequences. This rape was committed. And if the videotape had been lost, let's say hypothetically, she would have never known. There would have been no negative side effects for her whatsoever. A true consequentialist, someone who really believes in this form of utilitarian thinking, of judging actions by their consequences, would judge these two rapists differently.
Okay, so let's talk about these two cases. So we have two situations of rape. In one of the cases, the person finds out that they've been raped. The other case, they never actually find out, and we're supposed to consider them. And he's saying that a consequentialist is going to judge them differently. Now, I think that he's correct that the consequentialist is going to judge them differently. How the consequentialist judges them is going to be, we're going to have to do a lot more work to kind of figure that out. One thing that I talked about a little bit earlier was the importance of developing a good moral character, right? And you can see both of these acts as involving the same horrible, disgusting, like just horrendous, morally horrendous moral character, where you have somebody who thinks it's okay to just use somebody else for their own pleasure, and to just completely ignore the interests that people have in autonomy and in liberty and the ability to control what happens to their own bodies, right? So I think that the utilitarian and the we can take consequentialism more broadly. In both cases, they're going to say that this is a horrendous thing, and they can have just a really strict judgment of the person's character, simply because when we're coming up with like our principles for evaluating things, we're not just going to be looking at calculating consequences, right? Because if we just look at calculating consequences, we run into the trouble that I talked about earlier in terms of aggregate utility, right? So when we're talking about like a real world case like this, if we're asking the utilitarian, what do you think about this? The answer should be, gosh, this is horrendous. Like there should be strong moral principles that we all subscribe to that say that you shouldn't do this, because if you let people act in these sorts of ways, think about the sorts of characters that they're developing, right? You could also be a consequentialist who thinks that a right to bodily autonomy is something important, and that what we ought to do is maximize the satisfaction of rights. And if you're that sort of consequentialist, you could say that this is just intrinsically bad. Like you could say that particular violation, even if she never finds out about it, still involves a violation of her autonomy, and it still makes the world overall a worse place because it happened. Okay, so I think that a mistake that he made earlier is that he didn't give us like a really clear picture of what consequentialism is and what sorts of things consequentialist theories can count as consequences, right? But if we take just this broad conception of consequentialism, we're thinking about overall goodness of results, and overall goodness of results can include things like autonomy and liberty and all of that, then it's absolutely clear that in both cases, something really horrendous happened. Now, is there a difference between the cases? I would say yes, there is a difference. I mean, I think it should be obvious that there's a difference. In one case, in addition to the horrible autonomy violation, there was a lot of suffering that happened. In another case, there wasn't. In addition, in the case where the person never finds out about it, the rapist is going to run free and maybe do this again to other people. That's another horrible consequence of that, right? So I don't know like which world is worse, because in one world the person gets away with it, maybe to do this again and to do even more violations of autonomy. In the other world, they get caught, but the person who experiences the trauma suffers from it. So I don't know which world is worse, because I don't know how to weigh those two things against each other. I need a lot more information to be able to do that. But it does certainly seem true that they are different. It's just that they're both horrendous. Okay. So again, I don't think it's a fault of utilitarianism that they correctly notice that these are two different actions, and that they do carry different consequences, and that it might be that one is morally worse than the other. I'm not capable of telling you which one is worse, because I don't have enough information to be able to calculate the consequences. But instead, what I can do is I can talk about these other deliberation principles that consequentialists in general and utilitarians in particular are going to tell you to use. And that's going to be something like develop a good moral character, where you're not looking to use people merely as a tool. Okay, let's keep going.
In fact, strictly speaking, if you believe in the well-being centered model of utilitarianism, you might even have to regard one of them as neutral or good, but at a minimum, one would be much less evil than the other.
Well, the problem is if you completely screen off all of the consequences of something and then ask the utilitarian to calculate consequences, they might get some weird results, but we're talking about like a real world. We're talking about a situation where people are going to be living in a society, and we're talking about cases where this could happen again. But in addition, you could be an objectivist utilitarian who thinks that one thing we ought to be maximizing is the satisfaction of rights, including rights to bodily autonomy. And if that's the sort of utilitarian you are, there's no, you're not going to say that this was neutral or good, right? So either way, no matter what kind of utilitarian you are, you're not going to judge this applied ethical case in the real world as something good that happened. But you might even be, yeah. Anyways, let's keep going.
To me, that is irrelevant. Because when I'm judging a case of rape, I'm not judging the victim. I'm judging the perpetrator. I'm judging the decision that person made. And in many Western countries, on many schools of law, the rapist who in this way completely got away with the crime, where they left no awareness on the part of the victim was drugged in such a way, whether by a surgeon or otherwise, that it had none of these negative consequences, they may be more guilty. They may face a much sterner sentence precisely because the method used here reflects very clear premeditation. This person took responsibility. They made this decision. It wasn't spontaneous. They weren't drunk or distracted. There were no other possible excuses here to mitigate it. They will.
Good. And, a utilitarian, again, can support that. I think what we want to be doing is selecting for better characters. When we're coming up with our laws, we're coming up with how we want to set up our society. We don't want people in our community who are going to be committing those sorts of premeditated acts. So it makes sense from a utilitarian perspective, if we're trying to come up with laws to regulate our society, that we would want to punish premeditated murders more, or premeditated rape more than crimes of just opportunity. Okay.
Probably get a worse sentence. They will probably get a fuller sentence. They'll get more punishment than someone in some other circumstances that didn't show, for example, premeditation. Many Western cultures, not all, premeditation leads to the crime being judged more harshly, right? Judged or sentenced, I should say. And indeed, it may be a slightly different charge than other circumstances that are dealt with, okay? So consequentialism and utilitarianism lead to absurdities. Within veganism, right now, one of the main proponents of this, who I've criticized in many videos on my channel, is Unnatural Vegan. And her version of utilitarianism and consequentialism, she uses both terms to describe herself, leads her to make excuses for drinking milk as long as it's produced by a cow that's happy, eating meat. She will literally eat meat if she orders food and the waiter brings her the wrong order. So again, this is like secondhand leather.
All right, so I don't know this Unnatural Vegan character, but she doesn't sound like a very good utilitarian to me. I'll have to watch some of her videos. Maybe that wasn't fair. I'll check out some of her videos and I'll see if I have anything to say. But again, every time you are in a restaurant and you eat meat that's handed to you, you're giving up an opportunity to challenge speciesism. You're also creating the sort of character within your own soul that is okay with using animals merely as a means. And I think that we need to be talking more about how we want to develop our characters. We have good, strong utilitarian reasons to develop a character that says, I will not regard animals as here for my use, right? Because when I develop that sort of character, that disposes me to not go around looking for little loopholes for where I can use an animal here and use an animal there, because because the danger there is that I'll find a loophole that is not really a loophole, right? I'll find situations where I think I've found a way of permissibly using the animal, but I'm actually just causing more harm. And in this case, I think that's what's going on with this Unnatural Vegan person. It seems like what they've done is they've sort of taken on a theory of rightness and then used it as a theory of deliberation in such a way that they've then developed character traits where they're looking for excuses to use animals. And really what we should be doing is trying to develop a character trait, develop our characters in such a way that we're horrified by the prospect of eating animal flesh. We should be developing our characters in that way, because that's how we're going to be effective, fighters for, long-term change against speciesism, right? So again, I think what I'm going to say again is just if you think that utilitarianism tells you that you should just be eating meat or drinking dairy or whatever, you're just doing it wrong. Let's keep going.
Secondhand meat, secondhand cheese. She accepts that as vegan. So we now have a rationale for vegans eating. And again, put this into context in terms of the emotional and psychological reality. So if you order a vegan soup, I don't know, let's say you order a vegan minestrone soup, and you don't even say you're vegan. It's just, it's on the menu, it's vegan. And the waiter happens to bring you a pork dumpling soup. What's the mentality of this so-called vegan who subscribes to utilitarianism and consequentialism? Are they say, oh, great, oh, goody, oh, wonderful, here's my opportunity to eat pork? Because
Yeah, I think he's exactly right. I think that this is why utilitarians should not be eating pork, right? Because if they do, now they're training themselves to be always looking for opportunities to eat animal products rather than training themselves to see animal products as not for us to be consuming, right? I think what he's doing is he's giving like exactly the reasoning that utilitarians should use to like argue against this whole business of looking for loopholes, right? And instead just do the hard work of trying to develop your character in such a way that you are always working towards not seeing animals as here for us to use.
in their mind, they've justified this, they've vindicated this action by saying that if they don't eat it, it'll go into the garbage. They consider that a waste. I do not. I differ from this whole line of thinking, root and branch, as I've already said in an earlier video. So they might as well just use this animal product. They might as well just benefit from the immoral act someone else did. Same way, again, you want to benefit from the fact that your brother bought a leather coat, your grandmother bought a fur coat.
Again, is our society going to be better or worse if we have a bunch of people who are constantly looking for opportunities to benefit from the suffering of others? The answer is worse, and that's why utilitarians should be arguing against developing their character traits in the way that our friend Eisel, I think that was his name, is suggesting they will.
And they gave it to you for whatever. You got it secondhand. You didn't pay, but you still want the benefit. I mean, if you, again, the basket made by slaves, and the significance, the moral significance of refusing to use the basket. In refusing to use the basket, you're putting your foot down and saying, I will not be a part of slavery. Now,
and that's a very powerful protest tactic. That's something that utilitarians should say we should do if we want to be effective people at challenging slavery. If we take the basket, it's going to make us maybe think more kindly upon the institution of slavery. And that's a really dangerous thing to do to our characters. We shouldn't do that, even if we're just concerned with consequences.
I understand from a consequentialist perspective, you say, well, if you're just using the basket, are you really a part of slavery?
Exactly. This is exactly the point of separating between a theory of rightness and a theory of deliberation. It's a really bad idea to always be looking for, to always be trying to calculate consequences, because doing so isn't the thing that's always going to lead to the greatest possible consequences. In these sorts of cases where you have a strong incentive to go one way, like this just shows you the danger.
If you're wearing a leather jacket, I don't have to reach for this concept of indirect consequences, whether through the free market or psychology or what have you. I'm not really concerned about, the perception of others and, I don't know, your self-perception, how you feel about yourself. If you're wearing a leather jacket, my argument is simply that you are wearing a leather jacket. And the fact that in your mind you have this excuse that you didn't pay for it, your brother paid for it, is immaterial.
I agree. I think that this is what utilitarians should say, right? When we're in the business of practical deliberation about what we ought to do, we shouldn't be trying to calculate utility. What we should be doing instead, if we're going to be good little utilitarians, is follow the rules. If we're going to be good little utilitarians, we should be following rules like don't use animals, right? Because if we don't, we're going to put ourselves at risk of succumbing to these temptations.
It's irrelevant. That is, in plain English, simply not good enough. Now, I say this, with all due humility. There are circumstances. You're freezing to death on a desert island. There was literally no other clothing you could possibly. There are some excuses that are good enough. Okay, that's not one of them. Somebody else paid is not one of them, right?
I completely agree. And a utilitarian, again, this doesn't seem like an argument against utilitarian. This just seems like an argument against people who wrongly appeal to utilitarianism when they're trying to justify acting selfishly. And as a utilitarian, I want to join him in saying we need to put a stop to this.
Now, why do I use these examples that, from some perspectives, I've just been talking to people who really don't get how these examples are related? Ultimately, the judgment about rape doesn't have to do with the consequences for the victim. As I say, because I'm not judging the victim, I'm judging the perpetrator.
So what he's giving now is like a virtue ethics theory, right? He's not talking at all about the consequences to the victim. What he's saying is that he doesn't think that violations of autonomy are intrinsically bad. Instead, what he's doing is he's saying this individual has a bad character, right? And I want to point out that that's a pretty controversial position that somebody could take when it comes to ethics. And that's fine. Like I'm not gonna argue against that position. But it's unclear that that's going to do a better job of accommodating our intuitions than the utilitarian theory. It seems like really what's going on here, really what like where the tug is that we think that there's just something intrinsically wrong about violating somebody's autonomy in the ways that the rapist from his story do, right? And so to just like shift from thinking about consequence to thinking only about the the character of the perpetrator seems to miss that as well. Now, as I talked about earlier, I think the utilitarian and the consequentialist, there are some versions of those theories that will actually talk about the ways that the victim themselves are harmed. But the utilitarian can also talk about the importance of character. You know, when we're thinking about these principles of practical deliberation, where we should be trying to nurture a good moral character rather than simply always just be engaging in calculations of consequences.
We're judging, is this man a rapist? Is he guilty of rape? Okay. If you wear a leather jacket, you're wearing a leather jacket. You're engaged in animal use. It's like I said before, if it's a horse, I don't care that you didn't buy the horse. The fact that you keep a hypocrite in wearing a leather jacket on that slave plantation, no, it doesn't rely on any of these things. The question is about you as a person making the decision of who you are for the economy of Belize or someone else paid for it.
Okay, I think he just sort of repeats himself for a bit now. Hopefully that this video was helpful. Basically, there's just a couple of things that I think he's getting wrong. One of them is that utilitarianism, there's a big difference between a theory of right action and a theory of practical deliberation. And people from as far back as Jeremy Bentham have noticed that utilitarianism isn't always the best theory of practical deliberation. Later utilitarians like R.M. Hare even developed this theory that says that we should typically not be trying to calculate consequences when we're trying to deliberate, because doing that puts us at risk of not having all the information, not being able to calculate the information well, and engaging in biased motivated reasoning to promote our own selfish interests over the collective overall good, right? And then if we go back to Mill and this book, Utilitarianism, we also get this idea that character is incredibly important. And as utilitarians, we should be trying to develop good, virtuous characters. That, the sort of character where we're not motivated to go around looking for ways of exploiting others and benefiting from the exploitation of others, but instead we're looking for ways to protest against that exploitation, stand up against speciesism, refuse to participate, be the most effective agents in the fight against speciesism that we could possibly be. Okay, so that is my response. Hopefully this is helpful. I hope that I wasn't nasty or uncivil. I do think that Eisel, I think his name was, does bring up a couple of really interesting cases. I do think that we pretty much agree in our judgments of the cases. I think that just like him, I am pretty disgusted at people who want to use consequentialist reasoning to try to justify like drinking milk or ordering, delighting in eating meat when it's delivered accidentally to you in the restaurant, right? If you do that, you're developing your character in a really bad way. And I think we're on the same page about that. I think that where we might differ is that I see the primary importance of developing a good character as being in terms of creating a society of people with good characters, because in such a society, we're going to have much higher overall well-being. We're all going to be able to just treat each other better. And I think that he wants to say that character is itself, morally, like the intrinsically good thing that we should be trying to develop just out of its intrinsic importance. All right, so I'm going to end this now. Thanks very much for watching.